on stage to moderate this conversation.
Barely a couple of weeks ago, the country was agog with the landing of the Chandrayaan and whether we would be able to put a machine on the moon. We are talking about Elon Musk and others trying to colonize Mars, and we're always obsessed with the idea of space travel and of space colonization and exploration. But in my book, something much more fascinating is going on much closer home. A kind of miraculous exploration of the human brain, which is really a cosmos in itself. The single human brain has more than 80 billion neurons in it. Last year, a Chinese scientist, He Jiankei, gene-edited 2 live babies, 2 little girls in whom he edited the gene that would prevent them from having HIV. Other scientists, again in China, created 5 monkeys in whom they had induced a gene which would create schizophrenia. So this exploration of the human brain, of the human genome, the possibility today that each of us can sequence our genome, all of this is absolutely altering the landscape of human experience right here on Earth. And that is an exploration perhaps even more exciting and with greater impacts than our desire to explore the cosmos. So to discuss all of that, we have a really reputed doctor, author, and brain scientist who's a professor at the Duke University School of Medicine. He's affiliated with the Duke Center of Applied Genomics and Precision Medicine. And he's here to talk to us about the most cutting-edge discoveries about the human brain, what is going on, and why the genome is really the new gold or the new oil or whatever other metaphor that we'd like to have. So we're very, very happy to have you here, and thank you for coming. So, Dr. Murali, as I just said, it's fascinating that barely last year, we seem to have completely breached a human frontier, which is to gene edit 2 babies and induce, into monkeys this schizophrenia, gene edit these 2 babies from the possibility of getting HIV from their father. So can you talk to us about genome sequencing? Where is this level of discovery, and what is the impacts that are going to happen with this CRISPR technology?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. There's an old saying about genetics. Genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. All of us are different because of our genes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and between them, we have about 3 to 6 billion bits of coded information in our genes. About 20 years ago, when scientists were trying to crack this information, it took them 13 years and $400 million to map the human genome. A few months ago, a team in California broke the Guinness Book of World Records, where within 24 hours, they were able to do whole genome sequencing in an individual. This was a baby who had come to the hospital with unexplained seizures. They were not only able to sequence that baby's genome. A typical genome sequencing produces terabytes of data. So imagine a library full of books. So they were also able to use artificial intelligence to match that against all known genetic inherited abnormalities and identify the genetic mutation and find a treatment for that particular child. So this is where we've advanced from $400 million to about $1,000 to map the whole genome. There is also a gene editing technique now called CRISPR, which is derived from bacteria. Bacteria have this to protect themselves against viruses, with which you can use to modify, to snip the genes, to edit the gene, and then to insert new genetic material into human beings as a treatment. So instead of a drug, you insert genes. So what the Chinese have done in this case is this particular experiment, but they've also gone one step further, and let me tell you what they've done. They have inserted a very unique gene found in human brains into the embryos of monkeys. And they've delivered 6 monkey babies with this human brain gene, out of which 4 developed, and they've scanned the monkeys' brains to see if the monkeys' brains are developing in a way that a human baby's brain would develop. So we have crossed new frontiers, which raises enormous ethical issues. The Indian government has recently convened a panel for the first time to govern and regulate these technologies.
So, Murali, I'll come back to these questions about ethics, but before that, again, to just show us what is possible. So right now, we're talking about gene editing, so you can maybe decide which gender your child is going to be, or whether you can combat certain diseases. But now that you've mapped the entire human genome, is it that in the future, you might edit a child so that they have more compassion, or they're good at sports, or they are dominant, or, so are we going to be able to design our personalities? Is that going to be possible?
And one step further, if you do what is called as a germline editing, those traits are then passed along to future generations. If you do only somatic cell editing, then only you will benefit from those kinds of gene editing. So these are the kinds of thorny issues. I personally believe that it should be reserved for serious medical illnesses at this point. And that's why it's very important for us to have an ethical sort of framework in every country. Many countries are not ready for the implosion of these techniques. We, for example, have published a paper where we have used this technique in a family that had 5 generations of an early onset familial dementia. It was called fatal familial insomnia, a neurological condition caused by a genetic mutation where the person cannot sleep. And as a result, they develop dementia and they die. And so we use this technique in a mother to select using what is called as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to ensure that she was able to have a child free of this particular mutation. So in that kind of a use, I think it's a very clear medical, ethical use to save the life. But I think all of the issues could have genetic doping in athletes. Would it be good or bad? Would it equalize the field or would it worsen the field? I don't know the answer to that.
It's quite fascinating. I mean, soon it might be like you're shopping for qualities, like I said, whether about compassion in India.
Sure.
If this comes, then we are all going to have blue-eyed and fair, given our obsession with being fair.
If everyone's blonde, then there's no fun, right? You want variety, and that's what makes us so interesting as a human species. That's what gives rise to inventions, creativity. This concept is called neurodiversity. So George Church, one of the leading genetic scientists, and I wrote a blog recently. This is the likely direction the society may take, because every parent wants an intelligent child. Every parent wants their child to have the best chance possible. But as a society, we need to make sure that there's diversity of traits, because that's what's so critical for democracy. It's what's so critical for creativity.
It's ironic we're talking now about something so fundamental as neurodiversity, given that we are not even being able to protect diversity in our cultures.
Sure.
Now you're saying there's this possibility that we may all look fair, all have blonde hair, all have blue eyes, all be non-compassionate, so that's a frightening dystopia.
Yes.
But because the other aspect is so close, that if these scientists were able to induce schizophrenia in monkeys, are we also looking at the possibility of really mass-scale biowarfare, where enemy countries could really do that to you?
Absolutely. There's probably already intelligence agencies around the world thinking about using both genomic science and neuroscience to develop newer weapons. It's unfortunate. There's not a good way to guard against it because these are done in secret. But going back to your question about schizophrenia, mental illnesses and neurological diseases are the leading cause of disability. Now, schizophrenia is devastating, as is stroke, as is so many other conditions. We don't have good models because until now, mouse models have been the primary way to test experimental drugs against a variety of diseases. And of course, a mouse doesn't develop schizophrenia, a mouse doesn't develop Alzheimer's, a mouse cannot develop, a variety of cognitive conditions. So it's been very hard to really predict if a drug will work or not. And I think that is the reason why the Chinese scientists developed a breed of monkeys. I am not for it. I'm very squeamish about it. I'm very pro-animal rights. But I think that's where society is headed, and I don't know what the right answer to it is.
So we'll move away to the discoveries about the brain. Just one last question about genomes is that there's a big push, and in fact George Church is a big advocate of everybody now going in for personal genome sequencing. So even if we forget the large landscape, why is everyone advocating personal genome sequencing? What is the positive benefits of that?
So I would say right now, some of the hype exceeds the known benefits. There are also a lot of labs whose quality is not well checked. The regulations are not keeping up with the advances in technology. The flip side of that, as I pointed out with my opening statement, is that genetic loads the gun. Our risk for thousands of diseases is determined by genes. And there are many diseases that are what are called as single gene mutation diseases that are amenable to correction. So if we can map every baby's genome when the baby is born, and we can identify whether the baby has one of 16,000 or 20,000 known genetic mutations, then you might be able to correct it before the baby develops serious long-term abnormalities. There are already 5 gene therapies on the market to correct known genetic mutations, for cancer, for a type of blindness, for a type of spinal muscle weakness, etc. There are 800 clinical trials underway. So these therapies, I think, are much needed, and they will come. They will not change many of the common diseases like, say, obesity, heart disease, which are as a result of multiple genes. Those are much harder to correct. So I would say personal genomics for wellness is not as well established. So there's not a genetic profile that will make you a better Yogi Cameron or a better marathon runner. But certainly genes for medical purposes, I think, has its utility.
So, you know, earlier we heard Dr. Ian Lipkin talking about viruses, and I want to ask you about microbiomes. But before we come to that, you know, it's, and I may be naive in asking you this question, but there was this film, Lucy, which hinted that, you know, if we only use 20% of the human brain, and if we could use all of it, then we would possibly be what we now deem as superhuman. So is that true? You know, you're a brain scientist, you're mapping the human brain. Are there aspects of the human brain that we haven't even begun to access?
It's a great question. Will humans even know if there are aspects of the human brain that humans haven't accessed? I don't know the answer to that. But so I was actually in the trailer for Lucy, and I was also in the documentary for Lucy. I think the statement that humans only use 20% of our brain or only 10% of our brain is a myth. Because for every different task, we probably use a different amount and different types of brain regions. So this sort of myth is propagated either for movies or by people trying to empty your pockets. But that said, I think it serves a very useful purpose, right? I think of science fiction films as a great boost for our imagination. And what fires your imagination is what makes things happen. Because if you can't imagine it, it never becomes a reality. And if you can imagine that you can improve your brain, you certainly can, because we can all improve all our abilities, right? Creativity can be trained, empathy and compassion can be trained, memory can be trained, mathematical abilities can be trained. So practice makes perfect. So let's not forget that. Yes, we can all improve our brains, and I think it's a myth that we only use 20% of our brain.
You know, you mentioned 2 things which fascinate me. So let me ask the first one, which is that you just said that the human brain can be trained, and all of this can be trained. So, you know, we have this kind of great divide between Western science and Eastern sciences or Eastern knowledge systems. But Eastern knowledge systems have spoken about meditation, about accessing different levels of consciousness. And, you know, we're in India, and all of us have seen pictures of Naga sadhus doing unbelievable, physical things like pulling a truck with their penises and, you know, like really impossible things. So is there any mapping going on about what perhaps Eastern techniques do? That are there different levels in the brain you can access by using these techniques? Is there any empirical mapping going on of that?
So the short answer is yes. Not specifically studies of Naga sadhus. I've not heard of any in terms of neuroscience studies. But what little I know of Naga sadhus is that they practice, and it takes 10, 15, 20 years of practice and various forms of rituals for them to get to that stage. So to me, that's probably no different than, say, what a Roger Federer does or a Rafael Nadal does. 10,000 hours of practice, and rituals help a lot. So psychological research over the last 15, 20 years has revealed that you can train yourself to enter a state of mind called flow. When you're in a state of mind called flow, you're almost shutting out the higher frontal cortex, and you're engaging the more sort of lower, more primitive cortices, and you're entering a state of effortless perfection. So that's when, say, Michael Jordan is throwing the basketball, he hits every shot. Time stands still. You feel no pain. And that's probably the state that some of these sadhus, in a trance or in a mystical state, when they enter and they're able to perform these feats. But at the same time, I think our capacity is fixed. Our muscle capacity is fixed. We may not use it all the time. Most of us, I think, we use our muscles to 80% capacity, and in certain flight or fear conditions, let's say we're trying to run from a bear, or we think our child is going to get caught in an accident and we're doing something superhuman, we have that extra 20-30% reserve that lets us perform certain superhuman feats.
So I'm going to ask you very quickly about the really cutting-edge discoveries about the brain, but the other thing you mentioned was creativity. And that's another fascinating aspect of the human brain. Sometimes artists, musicians, even A.R. Rahman has spoken about how he feels that his creativity is really fueled because he's channeling something spiritual. His Sufi guru is actually almost, that he's basically a medium for something supernatural. Now that's an area that is really about faith. But again, my question to you is that, does such heightened states of faith, does it trigger something in the brain which accentuates creativity? Well, what explains that?
So we don't fully understand the neural basis of creativity. Einstein actually famously said, creativity comes not from knowledge, but from imagination. And Einstein's brain after his death was actually stolen by someone who drove it around the country in his car, and then it's been studied. They really could not find any anatomical or morphological change in the brain that would explain his genius and creativity. Now, there are other examples of people. For example, people who have gotten what is called as acquired savant syndrome. So normal people struck by lightning, or they have a head injury, and all of a sudden they become very creative, incredible artists. It appears that there's been some damage on the left side of their brain. There is a certain type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia, which robs their frontal part of their cortex. Many of those patients become incredible artists all of a sudden. It's almost like when the higher cortex, especially on the left side, is damaged, it seems to release some creative abilities we've not fully understood. Even autistic children sometimes are incredibly creative, and we know people with certain psychiatric illnesses. A large study was done in Iceland of 80,000 people, where they looked at the genetic traits in those 80,000 people. And then they looked at the genetic traits in a group of award-winning artists, music composers, and creative actors. And they found that the patients who had psychiatric genetic traits and the artists shared many genetic traits in common. And that may be why people like, say, Rembrandt or famous painters sometimes have bipolar disorder or traits of bipolar disorder. So there is some fine line between creativity, genius, and madness that we don't fully understand. Again, by no means am I being disrespectful to A.R. Rahman or anybody like that. It's possible that spirituality may draw on some of those same brain regions to activate the creativity. I don't know the answer to that.
So, before we come to microbiomes and just gestating the human brain, which is what George Church is doing, for you personally, of all the discoveries happening around the human brain, what has been the most exciting discovery for you?
Well, to me, I think there are two. So one is obviously what we can do with this gadget. We've seen this gadget in science fiction movies. I'm a huge fan of Star Trek, all these movies. It's amazing what this gadget and the watch is doing. You can diagnose now many psychiatric and neurological disorders with the smartphone. And I'll give you an example. Stroke. Stroke, many people in the audience, you're in the age that's prone for stroke. 1.4 million Indians suffer stroke. There's a stroke every 20 seconds. So by the time our session is over, there'll be 100 people who have stroke. One of the risk factors for stroke, besides sitting down for long periods of time, just kidding, is irregular heartbeats.
He's ensuring you give him a standing ovation.
Irregular heartbeats called atrial fibrillation. And for a long time, atrial fibrillation could not be detected unless you went into a hospital, they put you on a monitor, all of this, and you had a stroke and you could not reach the hospital in time. Now with the Apple Watch, for the first time, they have cleared an automatic way where the Apple Watch can send everyone who has an Apple Watch an immediate signal if the Apple Watch has an ECG built into it. That's a full medical grade ECG. And the ECG will tell you if you have an atrial fibrillation and give you an instant alert so that you can drive yourself to the hospital and prevent a stroke. So that's an example of how a life-threatening, disabling condition can be stopped with something like a watch. The other advance, of course, that I'm very excited by is new brain imaging technology. For a long time, we couldn't see what was in the brain. We could sort of look at the brain at autopsy. By that time, it was too late. Now with new brain scans, we can map the brain and we can begin to detect early signs of disease 1, 2, 3 decades before they happen. So for example, we developed a new brain scan along with a group of other investigators that can track early signs of Alzheimer's up to 20 years before there is memory loss. So that gives you a lot of time to begin to intervene and put in place measures to stop its progression and allows companies to test drugs. So these are the kinds of advances that I'm very excited about.
Since you're talking about technology, the fact that we are now so exposed to technology every second of our waking life and our sleeping, even when we're asleep, are we at all beginning to map what is happening to the human brain because of our constant dialogue with technology?
Well, for sure it's changing it.
Is there a kind of evolutionary leap happening?
I don't know if there's an evolutionary leap happening, but there's probably gradual changes, many of which are good, some of which are probably bad. So let's look at the good thing. Obviously, we don't have to memorize as much information, so we can spend more time doing sort of creative stuff, philosophical stuff, if we choose to use the time for that as opposed to watching movies. And on the bad side, obviously, people who are addicted to technology don't get enough sleep. Fear of missing out, our attention spans are dropping. So there's good and bad. Is it rewiring the brain in a permanent way? I don't think that's been established yet, but it's possible that it may.
So we'll come to microbiomes, but I don't know how many in the audience have seen this Netflix series called The Black Mirror, and you talked about how...
Well, let's see how many. How many have seen The Black Mirror?
Oh, that's a huge number. So, when we're talking about technology and the human life and human brain, there's one episode where a mother actually implants this in the child to be able to have surveillance on her and actually to protect her from harm, but it has terrible consequences. So is there any kind of ethical framework within which the kind of technology that you're already speaking about, the kind of brain discoveries, say what George Church is doing, are there any ethical frameworks in any of our countries around this?
So yes and no. The technologies are emerging so fast that they're outpacing all regulatory attempts to sort of put a fence around them. So I serve on a council for the World Economic Forum that has recently released some ethical guidelines for how to use neurotechnologies. But there's an incredible array of advances happening now. Elon Musk, many of you know who he is from Tesla, has a company called Neuralink that is aiming to develop a way for the brains to directly communicate with the internet without a phone or anything like that. So they're doing now early stage experiments. There are studies in animals now where they have developed a mesh that can be implanted on the brain, and the brain develops along with the mesh. and that mesh can be used for communication. And so it's kind of almost like science fiction movies coming true. I don't know if we're headed in that direction as a definite future, but I can see definite potential for treating diseases. So for example, if you have Parkinson's disease and you have intractable tremors, there is already a type of brain stimulation called deep brain stimulation that actually can be implanted, a pacemaker, that can permanently arrest those tremors. There is another chip that can be put in the brain to treat seizures. This is what is called as a closed loop system. It can detect when a part of the brain is about to go into an epileptic seizure, and it sends an electrical signal to stop the seizure before it occurs. So this is the kind of technology that's coming. Obviously, for paralyzed people, I can see a huge benefit if they can use their minds to type commands, to change TV remotes, to ask for assistance, to help them with their daily chores. So I think that's likely to be the first application in the civilian area.
So, we've run out of time, so if you can just give the elevator pitch on it, enough to stimulate everyone to look up Google, is this whole zone of microbiomes. Can you explain to us what microbiomes are? And again, what impact it's having on disease combat?
So the microbiome is all of the organisms that live in your human body, right? There are trillions of organisms in your skin, in your intestinal tract, in a number of your organs, possibly even in your brain. And I'm going to focus on the organisms in the gut. The organisms in the gut, trillions of them, they are really your second brain. They probably influence everything we're doing. They influence our mood. They may influence our brain development. They influence our risk for diseases. So there's an enormous focus to try to understand it and try to sort of see if there is a way to take advantage of it to maintain our health.
So that's a kind of entry point for the next time we host you.
Yes.
But you were talking about George Church. He's trying to create the human brain in a lab. Do you have any sense of how far away we are from getting brain transplants, the same way like we have kidney transplants?
Well, it's kind of spooky you say that because almost 80, 90 years ago, brain transplants were already attempted in animal models by scientists in different countries. Those were not experiments we would consider ethical today. But what scientists have succeeded in doing using stem cell technology, we can now take skin cells. We can coax the skin cells into becoming nerve cells. So in a sense, these are nerve cells from your own body. So they are like the nerve cells in your brain. And then we can put these nerve cells in a dish and they aggregate and they form what is called as a brain organoid. So you can form your own mini brain in a dish. And for the first time, they have succeeded in recording electrical signals from these organoids, suggesting that these organoids are developing into a physiological organism. So there are ethical issues. Will it ever develop into a full brain? Should we just use it to test drugs? So there's a number of unanswered issues, but that's, again, another area for science.
Thank you very, very much. As I said, in some ways, this is more fascinating than trying to reach Mars or all the galactic kind of explorations we do. And thank you for casting light into it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doraiswamy. That was a very fascinating conversation. Can I please request you to stay on stage for just a minute? Can we invite Captain Sanjay Gupta, President and Group General Manager, Petronet LNG, to please present Dr. Doraiswamy with a token of appreciation. Dr. Doraiswamy. Well, our next speaker is as much a Bombay wala as now he's a Delhi wala. He's constantly reinvented himself, from Prem in Vivah to Aditya Kashyap in Jab We Met to Kabir Singh. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Shahid Kapoor on heroes and anti-heroes